Thank you so much. Thank you for including me. It's a great pleasure to be starting off this extremely interesting interdisciplinary conference. I'll be talking about what is part of a broader project which focuses on immigrant integration. And part of the focus is on the effects of policy interventions with the goal of integrating immigrants. So integration is an explicit policy goal for many governments. This is certainly the case for governments in Europe and the United States, which is the context that most of my work focuses on. When we're talking about integration, it's kind of a vague term. There's not always general agreement as to what it means. I think one definition that maybe many scholars would be on board with is the dismantling of barriers to full participation of immigrants in society. So integration is not something that necessarily requires the elimination of cultural distinctiveness, but it does require that the immigrants take some steps in the direction of cultural integration, for example, by learning the language of the host country. And so in recent years, there has been some accumulation of work and quite careful causal evaluations on the effects of different interventions with the goal of integrating immigrants with mixed results. So there are some interventions or policies that have shown to work. For instance, we now have good evidence that citizenship causally increases both social and political integration of immigrants. There are other types of policies where null effects are found. Civic integration policies, for example, these are policies that would make legal status acquisition conditional on things like passing a particular knowledge test or demonstrating language proficiency. And then there are other types of policies like cultural bans that have been shown to even lead to the opposite effect, lower integration in some instances. And so what seems to be missing, or there's less work in that direction, is drawing systematic conclusions on types of interventions, sort of having some broad understanding of what are the types of policies that are more or less likely to lead to integration. And so this is part of what I'm trying to do in this project, to begin to provide a framework for thinking about the effects of different types of integration programs. And in this particular paper, I'm going to illustrate the argument in a historical context, which is the Americanization movement during the late 19th and early 20th century US. So this was a broad set of concerted efforts by both state and non-state actors aimed at integrating, or as was the explicit goal at the time, to even culturally assimilate immigrants. And I will empirically examine the effects of different Americanization initiatives. So why this is a good context? This period, the age of mass migration in the US, has a lot of parallels to today. This was the only other time in the history of the United States, for example, that the share of the foreign-born was as high as it is today, about 14%. There was a lot of heterogeneity in terms of policy, given the federal framework in the US, but also heterogeneity in terms of the kinds of immigrants that arrived to the country and their background. So we can see how different policies worked for different people, which is something important, I think, in this context. And from the point of view of social science, it's a period that gives us access to very rich historical data. So we have individual level information on the universe of the census of the US, and we can even link people over time, so examine the integration trajectory of immigrants in response to different policy initiatives. Just to give some background on this period and what the Americanization movement entailed, as I said, this was the period at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And the Americanization movement was driven by the fact that during this time, the US experienced a change in the kinds of immigrants that it received. Which is what's illustrated in this graph here. It's probably too small for you to actually read, and I apologize for that. But what it shows is the share of different sending regions in the total number of foreign-born in the US. And so what can be seen is that while around 1850, most immigrants arriving to the US were from Northern and Western Europe, so one would think that culturally, linguistically, even phenotypically close to Anglo-Saxons, this changes towards the end of the 19th century, with most immigrants arriving from Southern and Eastern Europe. And those were the immigrants that had a very different profile. They were less likely to speak English, less likely to be literate, more of them male, many of them having the intention of living for a few years and working in the US and then repatriating, so having a profile considered less assimilable overall. So that's what raised concerns about their integration, given rise to this movement with the explicit professed goal of assimilating them into the American life of the community. So the Americanization movement was initially a very loose, disorganized movement in which many different actors participated, mainly volunteers, members of the civil society, patriotic organizations, women's associations. But then it's a movement that gains momentum around the time of World War I, and that's the time when the state, not at the federal level, but at the level of the states and also counties and cities, starts becoming involved. And then it dies out completely in the early 1920s with the imposition of quotas and immigration restrictions. Then we see a shift of policy from having the goal of integrating immigrants to the goal of essentially barring entry to those that were considered unlikely to integrate. Because this was so broad, one way of classifying the types of initiatives that formed part of this movement is the following. We can think of interventions that were aimed at lowering the costs of immigrants in fitting into the host society. So one example there would be language classes or civics classes targeting adults. But there would be also initiatives like, for example, going door to door distributing pamphlets with information about life in the community. A second type of intervention would be based on the provision of incentives, and I'll discuss one explicit example later on. These were programs that were very often introduced by industrial employers, and they essentially paid people money for them to Americanize in different ways. And then finally, and this is where the state got more involved, we can think of policy as setting prescriptions, so giving targets, behavioral targets for immigrants to reach. And one example of that was the introduction of English-only laws in education, so requiring that immigrants speak English in primary schools. So how are we to think about the effects of these policies? Here, and I won't have much time to go in detail in this because this is a short presentation, I think it would be useful to start from a framework of individual optimization, taking these policies as given, and this is for this to correspond to the empirical analysis where these policies are going to be viewed as exogenous. Thinking about immigrants who are balancing costs and benefits in terms of providing integration efforts. And I call this effort because it's costly. Immigrants have to spend time and money in order to learn the language of the host country, or adopt other behaviors, form networks with members of the local population. And it's also not something that deterministically leads to higher integration, right? Integration is a two-sided process that requires that immigrants take certain steps and that there is acceptance from the part of the host society as well. So it's not obvious that exerting more effort will necessarily pay off, but other things equal, higher effort should increase the probability of successful integration. And these costs are heterogeneous in the sense that it's not equally easy for every immigrant or every immigrant group to provide the same amount of effort. For instance, groups that are linguistically or culturally more distant to the host society should find it harder to exert integration effort. So then, starting from a framework like that, we can think about policy and how it enters by altering essentially this decision making. And we can think of different policy components, and policy is usually a package that involves all of these components at the same time. It's a bundle. One element of it is incentives. So other things equal, incentives should increase effort and the likelihood of successful integration if they're sufficiently high-powered. So they don't necessarily always have to work. There could be immigrants that were already exerting the requisite effort or immigrants that still find it too costly to do so, but there should be a range of costs for which these incentives should increase effort provided. Thinking about prescriptions, however, setting particular targets that immigrants have to meet or particular behaviors that they have to engage in, this also has an incentivizing effect. So immigrants may try to meet the target, but for a range of costs, so for immigrants who might find it very difficult to meet this target, it could also have the opposite disincentivizing effect. So it's possible that seeing that no matter how much effort one puts in, the target is unlikely to be met, and that means that one is shut out of many possible benefits that come with meeting this target, then there could be people that provide less effort than they would in the absence of this prescription. So in terms of relevant empirical implications, policies that are very strong on this prescriptive component are likely to backfire. They don't have to, and they could actually be successful. This backlash effect would be more likely when the targets set are too high relative to the cost of effort of immigrants, or when they are not accompanied by associated incentives. So both components, both incentives and prescriptions, can have heterogeneous effects, but this negative effect is more likely to be seen in this case of these prescriptive policies. Empirically, I'm looking at two different initiatives that I think have elements that correspond pretty closely to one type of initiative that has a very strong incentive component with associated prescriptions, and a second one that is prescriptive without changing associated incentives. The first one is an initiative by a non-state actor. It's Henry Ford's $5 day plan, which is a classic Americanization program. The second one is English-only laws in education, and I'll go through each in turn. So the $5 day plan was introduced by Henry Ford in 1914 in his Highland Park assembly plant, which was the plant that manufactured the Model T. And it was a profit-sharing plan. So essentially, it allowed workers to participate in profit sharing, increasing wages at a level much higher than what other auto manufacturers would pay at the time. So there was a very high-powered incentive component there, but it was strictly conditional on prescriptions that had to be met, and these were these two. So workers would have to participate in the Ford English School. They would have to attend, as the quote here illustrates. This not only made certain that they would take part in the profit-sharing plan, but also gave them preferential treatment in things like promotions. And then the other component, which we would consider today highly paternalistic and having like an assimilationist character, was that their lifestyle would have to be approved by a special department at Ford that was called the sociological department. So people would visit the workers in their homes and essentially make sure that their lifestyle fit what was considered to be the lifestyle of a proper American. And that would involve things like meeting certain standards of hygiene, all behaviors like saving part of their wages. And so this is a picture from the end of year ceremony at the Ford English School. This is the proverbial melting pot in which the workers or the students would go in waving flags of many different countries, come out of the melting pot waving the flag of the United States, having become Americans. So how can we examine the effects of a plan like this? Here's where we can take advantage from data from the full universe of the US Census in 1910. So identify men, because those are easier to link across multiple decades, in cities in which a Ford factory was operational, men of working age. Find them in 1910 and then use their first and last name and their date of birth to link them in the 1920 census. And so that allows us to have a kind of panel, use individual fixed effects, and so examine the changes in the integration outcomes of workers that lived in Detroit or Highland Park and should have been affected by this plan compared to other workers in the auto industry in cities that had a Ford plant. And so we can control for broader trends across industries and across cities. And so I'm looking at 4 different outcomes that capture integration that can be identified with variables that are available in the census. And what these estimates here are showing you is the differential change in those outcomes for auto workers living in Detroit and Highland Park in 1910. So those that should have been affected by the plan compared to everyone else in the control group. And so what we can see is that those people have a higher likelihood of being proficient in English. This was the first target of the Ford program. They're more likely to have taken out first papers, which was the first step in the naturalization process, and more likely to be American citizens in 1920. And then we can also look at the measure of social integration, which is being married to a native-born spouse of native-born parents. We're looking at this in 1930, so 2 decades later. And these are the effects for different age groups in 1910. So intermarriage rates are higher for those people who in 1910 were exactly at those age groups between 15 and 24, that they were likely to find their spouse within the next 2 decades. So what this shows is that this incentive-based program had a positive effect on integration, and theoretically we would expect this to be more pronounced for those whose costs would be sufficiently high such that in the absence of incentives, they wouldn't exert the necessary effort before. And this is what we see. And this is even smaller than the graph I had before. I'm really sorry about that. So we can use two proxies of the cost of integration effort. One is the language of the country of origin, whether it was English or not. The other one is a continuous measure of linguistic distance from English. And so for 3 out of 4 outcomes, the positive effect on integration is higher for those who were coming from a non-English speaking country, or from those whose native language was more linguistically distant from English. The one exception is naturalization, but this is an outcome that is a bit hard or tricky to examine during that time because it was regulated because of the war. So there were many those considered enemy aliens could not apply for citizenship. Okay, I'll skip the robustness of this result and I'll go directly to the second part, which is this policy that sets a prescription without changing associated incentives, and this is the introduction of English-only laws in primary education. So at the time, the language framework in the US was heterogeneous. Very few states had a requirement for English to be used in education. There had been earlier waves of, or earlier attempts at language restriction that were repealed. But during this period, between 1909 and 1923, 27 states passed some form of English-only law or a foreign language ban. And so we can examine the effect of those bans, this time not on the foreign-born, but on their children, using not the full universe of the census, but a sample, because now we're looking at periods later in time where the full universe is not available. So focusing on US-born children of foreign-born fathers, we can identify those who were born in a state that enacted such a law and who were, by their year of birth, should have been affected by this law because they would have been at the compulsory schooling age range defined by the state. And so this is a difference in differences design where we compare these affected cohorts to older cohorts that would have been out of school by the time these laws were enacted and to states that never passed these laws. We can also compare neighboring states to make things more comparable. Here we cannot look at citizenship as an outcome because these are US-born children, so become automatically citizens. But we can examine the other two outcomes, and what this is showing you is trends over time and the effect of the law for affected cohorts. So we normalize at time t = 0 is the oldest cohort that should have been affected by these laws, and after that. Cohort should have had progressively more exposure to English-only law. So the left graph shows effects for English proficiency. Essentially, there is no effect. There's potentially some tendency for increased English proficiency that never is different from 0. On the right is the effect on intermarriage. And then there are no differences between affected and unaffected cohorts before. And then we can see a drop in intermarriage rates for the cohorts that become affected. So if anything, in this case, there is either no effect on the immediately relevant outcome or a negative effect on integration. And we should expect this, again, theoretically, to be more negative for those groups that had the higher cost of effort. And so this is what we see. If we look here at the proxy of cost of effort, which is whether the mother was English speaking or the mother was native born, we see that for those groups that may have found it easier to meet the target of English only in education, we see even a positive effect in English proficiency and a less negative or 0 effect on intermarriage rates. So for very high costs of effort, the negative effect is coming from those who find it much harder to meet the target. So I'll conclude at this point, and I'm sorry for running over time, that one takeaway of this is that incentive-based programs can be effective, and prescription-based policies without associated changes in incentives may be counterproductive. This, by the way, is consistent with the literature on the effects of bilingual education that would suggest that bilingual education essentially means lowering the target, and that counterintuitively should increase integration rather than decrease it, because it makes it easier for children to use the native language to learn better English at school. And just the final thing, this is by no means an exhaustive framework of what the effects of law are. It's just zooming in into what I think is a relevant mechanism. What is entirely left out of here, but is of very much of interest in my own work and something that I've studied in other papers, is the psychological effect of law. which can change some of the conclusions that are reached here, and in particular effects on identity or symbolic effects of policies that might trigger resentment and a reaction, even in the case of incentives that, from a material point of view, should increase integration effort. So I'll conclude here, and again, sorry for running over time. Thank you.